Okay, cool. Give us a wave. No.
If you thought about what this was doing to your family?
Don't know.
Well, you must know.
Can't remember. Saw him that many times. Possibly at some point.
Okay.
Can't imagine it's very nice.
Terrible.
This is my brother Matthew. 6 years ago, my entire family and all of his friends' lives were turned upside down when he was diagnosed with a mental condition called psychosis. We didn't know this at the time, but the 6 years after were going to be some of the hardest and most testing that all of us had ever been through.
Started, going on and doing more adolescent things like drinking, and we all sort of partook in that. But Matthew he moved away from the group slightly and started hanging about with another group, but he still stayed in contact with us. But they were more sort of into smoking weed and doing stuff like that, and we were more kind of just drinking at the weekend and whilst doing just hanging out and not really into that sort of thing. But Matthew went down that path, and I think that's when we started to notice the changes in his behaviour.
Up until recently, Matthew has found it incredibly difficult to come to terms with this part of his past.
Behaviour at the time was deemed normal by me, but I think it was more a lot of other people around me started noticing my behaviour was irrational. At the school called Dad and had said there'd been a decline in my work and that my behaviour was quite off. I wasn't talking to many of my friends, and I just spent a lot of my time smoking a lot of cannabis.
What's the story?
This is the story. I don't know, it started with getting Adam's name tattooed on me and then kind of got addicted from there.
What's the one next to the razor blade say?
That's some Elliott Smith song. Those are my two quite wanky emo tattoos that I might get covered up at some point. It says, "Everybody cares, everybody understands."
What's that?
It's a song of his about alcoholism and drug addiction and being depressed. Title being ironic, obviously.
So what about his first trip into hospital? What happened there? Why did he get taken
Well, that was
in?
his first trip into hospital, and he thought I was going to be really cross with him, which obviously I wasn't. I was very, very upset and sad that should have happened. The next incident was when he smashed up a bus shelter and ended up in the cells for 2 nights and then was taken to court. That was horrendous, absolutely horrendous. I was beside myself that time. That was awful. It was only around then that your dad and I found out, in one of his admissions to hospital, where he thought your dad and I were aliens and that we had put a chip in his head, and up until then we hadn't known, but this would all tie in with psychosis, which is what had happened to him.
I found out that Matthew had been in the hospital and that he'd been diagnosed with illness, and in a way that sort of just made everything sort of make sense in his behaviour and what was happening. I mean, people suspected that not everything was right for a wee while now, and when that kind of made us understand that it was clinical. And at first, I'll be honest, I didn't really know how to go about talking to Matthew about it. I just sort of tried to continue and carry on as everything was normal, and didn't really speak to Matthew about it. We just sort of had a joke about it, but didn't really get too in depth. And it wasn't until another party we were at, it was just a mutual friend, and I think Matthew was wearing a jumper but his sleeves were rolled up, and that's when I noticed that he had some pretty bad scars on his arms. And so I waited until I had a chance to speak to him on my own later on that night, and I spoke to him about it, and he was telling me about how he'd tried to take his own life, and about just how bad he was feeling. And it was only really then that I think it really did dawn on me that it was so bad for Matthew, what he was going through. And I just remember speaking to him, I was like, Matthew, like, please don't do that again. It was really upsetting. I think a pair of us both ended up in tears. We were just, because it was to someone that you've known for years, to hear them speak that way, it was really unsettling. It was upsetting as well. But I'm glad that we had that conversation, because up until then, I don't think I felt like I understood really exactly how bad the situation had got.
We went to my dad's house and we walked into the living room. The front door was open. We walked into the living room, and Matthew was sitting on the couch with his wrists sort of held akimbo over the floor, and they were dripping with blood. And his feet, he was in his bare feet in a pool of his own blood. And he had went to my dad's house and drank a bottle of his alcohol, his vodka, and the voices, the psychotic voices, the voices that he hears in his head had told him to try and kill himself. And he subsequently went into the bathroom of my dad and my dad's medicine cabinet and took out one of his razors and dismantled it and started lacerating his wrists and legs with a razor blade. And once he had done this, he had went back into the cabinet and taken 4 sachets of painkillers and took them all in an attempt to overdose, washing it down with vodka. That was the earliest episode that I witnessed from him, and it was the most emotionally heart-wrenching, because seeing my brother's face as he looked at us with a sort of vulnerable, childish look on his face, he looked a wreck. He wasn't sound emotionally, mentally. He was unstable, and he just looked at us in a sort of cry for help. And for me, that was just, even recalling it it's a struggle, because that's my big brother and he is who I look up to in life, and seeing him like that, it gets harder and harder every time.
It was more of a kind of an escape route. It was an escapist behaviour type thing for dealing with the problems that I had.
What was?
The self-harm. And I actually started self-harming pre-admission to hospital, pre any kind of...
What were you doing?
Contact, just cutting my arms with the razor blades. I had this behavioural pattern of I'd go out and buy a bottle of vodka and some razor blades with the full intention of staying in that night, drinking that bottle of vodka and making a mess of my arms and legs.
remember when he was 15, he had his first episode of self-harm, and we were away for the weekend. It was in the flat, and subsequently he was taken to hospital, not seriously injured, but to be seen at the Western, and the psychiatry house officer, I think, was probably a very astute doctor and told us that he was psychotic, and at that point I hadn't an inkling that he was psychotic, but it became apparent that morning he was very psychotic. We were very upset, we were all very upset, because I happen to know a little bit about psychosis, and you know that a first episode of psychosis is the harbinger of lifelong mental health problems in many cases, to the extent that there were, if you like, very severe cases of men and women who were completely incapacitated by their illness and completely dependent on others for their care and completely unable to live any sort of fulfilled life that you imagine would be the lot of one's apparently healthy sons.
Growing up beside Matthew has really strengthened my knowledge of the seriousness of a condition like psychosis and the side effects and symptoms that comes with it. And because I'm older and more mature as a person, I've gotten to know Matthew and the illness that he has to live with every day of his life, and I have a lot more of an appreciation of how hard it can be for him. Today he's a lot healthier, he's a lot happier. I think that he's 22 now, coming on 23, and I think getting back into the educational system has really given him a lot of motivation to progress in life, and I think that Adam has been one of the motivations for Matthew staying healthy these days. He wants to see Adam grow up and vice versa, and it supports. I think Matthew gets a lot of rest and peace in the knowledge that he's helping Adam grow up to be the person that he wants himself to be, and we're all there to see Adam grow up. He's a wonderful child, and he's a brother who we love with all our hearts, and I think that really gave Matthew a bit of the confidence and motivation to stay alive and to keep himself alive and healthy and fight the illness to the bitter end.
Wave to the camera, wave bye bye.